A black lawyer had just won the biggest case of his career. Ready to celebrate with his family. But when he steps into an upscale restaurant to meet them, everything changes. A wealthy businessman mistakes him for the waitstaff. And when he corrects him, security is called. Within minutes, he's humiliated in front of a packed room and forced to leave. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary evening. Until it wasn't. Eddie Graham had always been careful about how he moved through the world. It was something he learned young. How to step lightly, how to read a room before it read him, how to carry himself so that the weight of other people's expectations never settled too heavily on his shoulders. It was a lesson he had inherited. His father had been a man of measured words. His mother a woman of unshakable grace. And they had raised him to understand that survival, for a black man in America, was not just about being good but about being exceptional. That was why today should have felt like a victory. A seat in first class. A hard-earned ticket, not a gift. A rare moment of comfort in a life that had known too little of it. But even before he had placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, he had felt it. The shift in the air. The sideways glances. The unspoken question behind every pair of eyes that lingered on him just a second too long. He sat down, adjusting his suit jacket, pretending not to notice. The cabin was quiet but charged. He could feel it. An older white man across the aisle. His posture stiff. His expression carefully neutral. A younger man 2 rows ahead. Glancing back with something like curiosity. Or suspicion. The flight attendant passed by. Offering pre-flight drinks. Champagne. Sir? Eddie nodded. Offering a polite smile. Thank you. She hesitated. Just for a breath of a second. And then poured. A small moment. A fleeting pause. But he had seen it before. The first challenge. The tension did not come all at once. It never did. It arrived in small doses. Little reminders stitched into the fabric of the everyday. Excuse me, a voice said from the aisle. Eddie looked up to see a man standing beside him. An expensive watch glinting under the cabin lights. He was white, mid-50s, the type of man who had never wondered whether or not he belonged in a place like this. You must be in the wrong seat, the man said, his voice even, polite, but firm. Eddie felt the weight of it before he even responded. The assumption, the certainty. Pardon? Your seat. The man gestured toward the ticket stub in Eddie's hand. I think there's been a mix-up. Eddie exhaled slowly. He had been here before. No mix-up, he said. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. A pause. A flicker of disbelief crossed the man's face. Then, an awkward chuckle. Ah, he said, as if Eddie had just revealed a trick. Well, enjoy your flight. He moved past, but not before giving one last glance. A measuring look. Eddie had seen that look before. 2. The weight of being seen. The flight took off, and Eddie leaned back, letting the hum of the engines settle in his chest. He knew better than to let a moment like that shake him. But it had. Not because it was new, but because it never stopped happening. Because no matter how many degrees, how many promotions, how many seats earned, there was always that glance. That question. That pause. He let his eyes drift across the cabin, taking in the other passengers. A white woman 2 rows ahead stole a quick look at him before turning back to her magazine. A businessman, gray hair and sharp suit, whispered something to his seatmate, their eyes flickering in Eddie's direction. No one said anything, but that was the thing. Wasn't it? They didn't have to. He closed his eyes, breathing slow. It was going to be a long flight. The flight was quiet, but Eddie could feel the unspoken conversations happening around him. That was the thing about racism. It did not always announce itself in sharp words or raised voices. Sometimes, it lived in the pauses, in the glances, in the small hesitations that told you everything about the world you were navigating. The businessman across the aisle had gone back to reading his newspaper. But every now and then, his eyes flicked toward Eddie as if trying to place him, to make sense of why he was here. Eddie sipped his champagne and looked out the window, refusing to give it air. He had learned long ago that if you reacted to every moment like this, you would never get any peace. But peace was a tricky thing. Because just as he had settled into his seat, just as he had exhaled and let himself believe that this moment would pass, another voice found him. A woman, older, her silver hair pinned into a neat bun, leaned slightly into the aisle. Her expression was pleasant, polite. "Excuse me," she said, her voice honeyed with familiarity. "I think I saw you earlier helping with the bags." Eddie turned toward her, blinking. "Pardon?" She smiled. "I saw you helping a passenger with their luggage. You must be with the airline." "Yes?" Eddie stared at her, and something inside him tightened. It was not the question itself. It was the certainty in her voice. He could see the moment stretch between them. See the way her mind had already built the story. A black man in first class? It made more sense to her that he worked here than that he was a passenger. She was waiting for confirmation. Eddie gave her nothing. "I'm not with the airline," he said, his voice measured. "I'm a passenger, just like you." Oh, a small pause. A flicker of something that might have been embarrassment or confusion. "Well, I just thought." Quote. He waited, letting the silence fill the space she had created. She cleared her throat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I see," she said finally, turning back toward her seat. But Eddie saw the way she shifted. Saw the way she suddenly seemed uncomfortable. As if he had done something wrong. As if his very presence had unsettled her. He exhaled slowly. The weight of expectations. The flight attendant returned, refilling glasses. She moved down the aisle, smiling at each passenger. But when she reached Eddie, she hesitated. It was barely a second. A pause so small most people wouldn't have noticed. But Eddie noticed. She glanced at his seat number. Then at him. "Can I help you, sir?" Eddie frowned. "I was just waiting for a refill." She hesitated again, then smiled. "Too bright." "Of course. Sorry about that." She poured the champagne, but her hand was just a little too careful, as if afraid of spilling. Eddie watched her move down the aisle, watched her smile come more easily for the other passengers, and watched how she never hesitated with them. There was a difference in the way people moved around you when they did not expect you to be somewhere. And that was the thing. Wasn't it? It was not that they hated him. It was that they did not expect him. And expectation was everything. Because when people did not expect you to belong, they questioned your presence. They questioned your legitimacy. They questioned your right to sit where you were sitting. To exist where you were existing. The assumption that he must be an employee. The hesitation before pouring his drink. These were not accidents. They were part of the same machinery. Part of the same quiet but constant message. This space is not for you. Eddie sighed, rolling his shoulders. He had been dealing with this his entire life. But today, it was beginning to wear on him. And something told him this flight was far from over. Eddie sat still, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. The hum of the plane's engine filled the space. A steady reminder of how far he was from solid ground. He exhaled, staring out at the sky, willing himself to feel weightless. But the moment clung to him, like a stain that refused to be washed out. It wasn't just the woman's assumption. It wasn't just the hesitation of the flight attendant. It was the sum of all these moments. Because it was never just one moment. It was their lifetime. It was the security guard who had followed him in a store when he was 15. Even though his hands were empty. It was the professor in college who asked if he was in the right classroom on the first day of class. It was the waiter who always handed the check to the white colleague at the table. Assuming Eddie wasn't the one paying. It was all the ways the world told him, over and over again, that he was still not fully seen. And now, here, in this first-class cabin, it was happening again. He knew how to let it go. He knew how to shake it off. He had learned that survival sometimes meant swallowing the small humiliations. But today, something in him refused to stay silent. He turned back toward the woman who had mistaken him for airline staff. "Excuse me," he said, his voice even, controlled. She looked up, startled. "I wanted to ask," he continued, tilting his head slightly. "Why did you assume I worked for the airline?" The woman's face shifted, first confusion, then discomfort. Oh, I just thought. She gave a soft, nervous laugh. I saw you standing earlier, helping someone with their bag. I just assumed. Quote. Eddie nodded slowly. Did you assume that about anyone else? The question hung between them, heavy and unshakable. She blinked, opened her mouth, closed it again. She started, but there was nothing behind the words. She turned back to her book, her face tight with quiet embarrassment. Eddie didn't press her. He had said what he needed to say. And maybe, just maybe, it would sit with her for a while. The eyes of the cabin. Eddie could feel the shift. It was the way people started noticing him now. How? Even when they weren't looking directly at him, they were aware of him. The businessman across the aisle had lowered his newspaper slightly, just enough to watch. The older woman had gone back to her book, but he could see the way she turned the pages faster than before. The flight attendant moved more carefully around him now, her eyes flicking toward him but never quite meeting his gaze. It was a familiar dance. People did not like being forced to see their own biases. Eddie let out a breath and tried to settle back into his seat. But peace would not come. Because the moment he had spoken, the moment he had refused to let the assumption slide, something had changed in the air. And when you were black in America, calling out racism, even in the gentlest of ways, could make people uncomfortable. And discomfort, Eddie knew, could be dangerous. The first complaint. It didn't take long. The flight attendant returned, her smile forced, stretched too tight over something else. Sir, she said, her voice all polite restraint. I just wanted to check if everything is all right. Eddie looked at her. She wasn't really asking. She was assessing. There had been a shift. And now, she was here to manage it. He had done nothing. He had simply asked a question. But already, there was a feeling, an unspoken tension. People were watching. He smiled slightly, tilting his head. I'm fine, he said. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the drink tray. Okay, she said after a beat. And walked away. Eddie signed. It was a fragile peace. One that could be disrupted by something as small as a raised voice. A gesture taken the wrong way. And that was the truth of it. Black men in America had to be careful, even when they were the ones being wronged. Because the wrong tone, the wrong expression, the wrong word, could turn the whole situation against them. Eddie knew that. And something told him the flight wasn't over yet. Eddie felt the eyes on him. Not the direct, confrontational kind. No one dared to meet his gaze for more than a second. No, this was the quieter kind of watching. The kind that happened in glances stolen from behind newspapers. In the reflection of a phone screen. In the way people shifted in their seats as though they had suddenly become too aware of the space around them. He had seen this before. It was the kind of silence that grew in the space after a black man dared to challenge something. The air changed, heavy with the kind of tension that made people pretend they weren't listening while they held their breath for what might come next. And Eddie knew what could come next. The whispered complaint. It didn't take long. He heard it first. A low voice. Careful. Just behind him. I just think it's best if we avoid any disruptions. The words came from a man in a navy suit, speaking in hushed tones to the flight attendant. A pause. I don't want any trouble. The man continued, his voice dipping even lower. It's just, some of us paid a lot for this experience. And we shouldn't have to deal with. He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Eddie closed his eyes for a moment. This was the game. There had been no shouting, no raised voices, no threats. But already, he was becoming the problem. And that was the trick, wasn't it? They did not need him to do anything. His existence, his presence in a place they had not expected him to be, was disruption enough. The fragile order. The flight attendant approached again. Slower this time. Her smile was gone, replaced with something else. Polite authority. The mask of forced patience. Sir, she said, keeping her voice low, I just want to check in. We've received a concern from another passenger. Eddie let out a small breath. A concern. Not a complaint. Not a formal issue. Just enough of a whisper to suggest that something wasn't quite right. Did I do something wrong? He asked, keeping his voice steady. No, she said quickly. Too quickly. Then she hesitated. It's just, we want to ensure all passengers are comfortable. He let her words sit between them for a moment. All passengers. But not him. Not the black man in first class who had the audacity to question someone's assumption. Not the man who had spoken a little too firmly. Who had made the wrong kind of impression. And that was how it always happened. The world would not accuse him outright. It would not tell him to leave. It would simply make it clear that his presence, his voice, his very being, was an intrusion. And then it would wait for him to decide how much of himself he was willing to shrink in order to keep the peace. The decision. Eddie glanced past the flight attendant, catching the eye of the man in the navy suit. The man looked away. Of course he did. Cowards always did. Eddie turned back to the flight attendant. So let me understand, he said, his voice slow, deliberate. Someone felt uncomfortable because I asked a question? The flight attendant's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to deny it. But she had nothing to stand on. Eddie could feel the cabin listening. Waiting. Because that was the thing about moments like these. No one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. No one wanted to admit that. In this space of so-called equality, there were still expectations about who belonged and who didn't. The flight attendant hesitated, then shook her head. It's not that, sir. We just want to make sure. Quote. I'm fine, Eddie said, cutting her off gently. Unless you're asking me to move? Her eyes widened slightly. Oh, no, sir. Of course not. Quote. Then I'll be right here, he said. He leaned back into his seat. Slow and deliberate, reclaiming the space they had tried to make him feel unworthy of. The flight attendant hesitated for a second longer, then nodded and stepped away. And just like that, the eyes disappeared. The quiet resumed. But Eddie knew what had really happened. They had decided to let him stay. But only on the condition that he stayed small. Eddie did not need to turn around to feel the weight of the eyes on him. It was the kind of attention he had grown used to. Watchful, uncertain, waiting, not open hostility, no outright rejection, just the unspoken suggestion that he did not belong. That something about him had tilted the balance of the room in a way that made people uneasy. This was what it meant to be a black man in America. To exist in spaces that were not built for you and to always be aware of the invisible lines separating tolerated presence from unwelcome intrusion. And tonight, at a hotel bar in the city, that line was growing thinner by the second. The unwritten rules. The bartender had ignored him for 5 minutes. Eddie timed it. 5 minutes of watching glasses being wiped. Orders being taken. Conversations flowing around him like a current determined to pass him by. It was a small thing. Almost imperceptible. The bartender was busy. The room was full. But Eddie had been standing there long enough to know that the people who arrived after him had been served first. He cleared his throat, raising a hand slightly. Excuse me. The bartender's head snapped up as if Eddie had startled him. He blinked, then offered a polite but distant nod. Yeah, what can I get you? The man's name tag read James. And Eddie could already tell that James was trying to decide something. Whether to treat him like a man or like a problem. A name that doesn't fit. Eddie ordered a whiskey. Neat. James poured it without comment, setting the glass in front of him. No pleasantries. No casual "where you from, man?" like he had heard him say to the last 2 men before him. Eddie let it slide. Or, at least, he tried. But then he heard the voice behind him. Didn't expect to see you again so soon. It was the man from the plane. The one in the navy suit. Eddie turned slowly, lifting his glass. What a coincidence. The man smiled. But it was the same smile he had used back then. Thin, forced, a little too pleased with itself. I didn't catch your name earlier. The man said. I'm Richard. Eddie studied him for a moment before answering. Eddie. Richard's smile faltered just a bit. Like the name didn't sit right with him. He recovered quickly, tilting his head. Eddie, he repeated. Short for Edward? It was a harmless question. Or, at least, it was meant to sound that way. But Eddie had been in enough rooms with enough men like Richard to know what he was really asking. He was looking for a different name. A name that might make him feel more comfortable. A name that might explain why Eddie was in first class. In this hotel. In this bar. A name that sounded like it belonged. Eddie let the silence stretch for a beat too long before taking a sip of his drink. No, he said. Just Eddie. A familiar pattern. Richard chuckled, but there was something strained about it. He took a slow sip of his own drink, glancing around as if searching for an audience. Then, as if on cue, he leaned in slightly. You know, Eddie, I admire men like you, he said, his voice dropping just enough to feel conspiratorial. Men who, he gestured vaguely, work hard, pull themselves up. I respect that. Eddie had to stop himself from laughing. It was always this. The compliment wrapped in a quiet assumption. The admiration was laced with surprise. The unspoken belief that black men like him were exceptions. He let Richard's words settle between them, pretending to consider them, before raising an eyebrow. And what kind of man am I? Richard hesitated. I just mean, someone like you. Well, you must have worked twice as hard as the rest of us to get here. The rest of us. Eddie took another sip. That's an interesting way to put it, he said. Richard's smile tightened. I mean it as a compliment, he added quickly. Eddie nodded, setting his glass down. I know you do. The smallest distances. Richard shifted slightly in his seat, glancing at James, the bartender, who was listening without trying to be obvious about it. He took another sip of his drink, then exhaled. Well, he said, forcing a chuckle, I suppose we'll be seeing more of each other tonight. You staying here? Eddie nodded. Richard raised his glass slightly. Then let's toast to good company. It was a test. A subtle one. If Eddie clinked glasses, the moment would pass, and they could pretend none of this had happened. He had been in these situations before. In boardrooms, in restaurants, in meetings where his presence alone made people ask themselves quiet, uncomfortable questions. And he knew that this moment, this interaction, was not about Richard. Not really. It was about the choices Eddie had to make every single day. When to let things slide. When to push back. When to remind the world that he was not here to entertain its expectations. He picked up his glass, held it in the air, and then, slow, deliberate, he set it back down without taking a drink. Richard's smile faltered for the second time that night. Eddie leaned in slightly, just enough to close the space between them. Have a good night, Richard. Then he turned, lifting his glass to his lips, and drank. The whiskey burned warm in his throat. And for the first time that evening, Eddie let himself enjoy it. The night was quieter than it should have been. Even in the heart of the city, where neon signs flickered and car horns cut through the damp air. The silence in the hotel lobby felt deliberate. It was the kind of silence Eddie had learned to recognize. Not the absence of sound, but the weight of something unspoken. Something waiting to happen. And as he stepped toward the front desk, he knew he was the reason the room had changed. A seat at the table. Eddie had spent the last 2 hours sitting alone at the bar, letting the whiskey settle in his chest, cooling the fire that Richard's words had ignited. He had been ready to call it a night. But then, just as he reached the elevators, he heard his name. Eddie? He turned, and there she was. Margaret Alden. She was standing near a round table, surrounded by men in tailored suits. The kind of men whose laughter came easy, whose presence in places like this was never questioned. She wore confidence like it was stitched into the seams of her silk blouse. Her hair swept back in a way that suggested precision. Control. Eddie had met her once before. A brief conversation at an industry gala. A moment too short to call her an acquaintance. Too charged to call her a stranger. Didn't expect to see you here, she said, tilting her head slightly, as if seeing him in this space required reconfiguring something in her mind. Likewise, Eddie said. Margaret glanced toward the empty seat at her table. Join us? It was an offer wrapped in something unsaid. Eddie looked at the men sitting around her, at the way their conversation had slowed, at the flicker of curiosity in their eyes. And he knew what this was. A test. Not from Margaret, but from the moment itself. Would he sit down and prove that he belonged? Or would he walk away, leaving them to believe that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been meant to be here in the first place? The conversation that wasn't meant for him. Eddie sat down. The conversation resumed, but the rhythm had shifted. There were subtle things, The way some of them leaned back slightly. The way a few exchanged glances before continuing as if nothing had changed. Margaret introduced him. Eddie Daniels, investment strategist. Worked on the Westbrook acquisition last year. One of the men nodded. A flicker of recognition passing across his face. Impressive deal, he said. Didn't expect that outcome. Eddie smiled slightly. Neither did they. A few chuckles. A test passed. But then came the real moment. The one he had been waiting for. The one he always knew would come. One of the men, a silver-haired executive whose cufflinks gleamed under the low lighting, leaned forward. So, Eddie, he said, swirling the drink in his glass. Where'd you go to school? It was a casual question. But not really. It was a placement question. A way of figuring out how he had gotten here. Of mapping his origins to see if they aligned with their world. Eddie could have told the truth. Could have said that he had gone to Princeton. That he had graduated at the top of his class. That he had interned under one of the most powerful financial advisors in the country. But that wasn't what the man wanted to know. What he really wanted to ask was, how did you get in? Because men like him. Men like them. They didn't expect to see men like Eddie unless they had been let in. Eddie let the question sit there for a second, stretching the silence until it became something tangible. Then he said, simply, I studied finance. And he let that be enough. The shift in the room. Margaret watched him closely. She could tell. She could tell that he had answered just enough to satisfy the curiosity but not enough to give them what they wanted. And that was when he saw it. The smallest shift in the room. It was in the way the men adjusted their postures. In the way their nods became slightly more clipped. In the way the energy changed. Just enough for Eddie to feel it. Just enough to remind him that there were lines that could not be crossed without consequence. He had passed the test. But he had also failed. Because there was only one way to truly belong here. And that was to never make them question why he was there in the first place. The unspoken goodbye. Margaret turned the conversation back to safer ground. Market trends. Future investments. The usual dance of numbers and power. But the moment had already happened. And Eddie knew it. He had done this before. Sat at tables where he was tolerated but not welcomed. Where his presence was noted but never fully embraced. And he had learned something over the years. It was not the loud moments that wore a man down. Not the slurs or the outright exclusions. It was this. The weight of silence. The moments where you realized that no matter how sharp you were. No matter how well you played the game. The room would always recognize you as something different. The moment passed. The men went back to their conversations. And Eddie listened, but he was already gone. Margaret turned to him once more, offering a small, unreadable smile. And in that look, he saw something he couldn't quite name. A challenge. A warning. A question she did not ask out loud. How long can you do this before it breaks you? Eddie stood up. He nodded at Margaret. At the men who had decided, in their own quiet way, that he was both acceptable and expendable. Then he walked away. Not because he had lost. But because he refused to keep proving that he had won. There was something about the way silence stretched in certain rooms. The way it filled the spaces between words. Pressing against the walls. Threatening to make a man smaller if he let it. Eddie Daniels had learned to recognize that silence. It had followed him through boardrooms. Across dinner tables. In the back seats of polished cars where men spoke in careful, measured tones. But tonight, the silence felt different. Tonight, it felt like a warning. The price of power. It started with a phone call. An invitation. One of those calls that didn't come often. The kind that meant you were either being tested or being welcomed. Or both at once. We're having a small gathering. Richard's voice had been smooth over the line. I think you should be there. Richard Alden was the kind of man who made decisions long before anyone realized a choice had even been offered. And tonight, his house, a sleek, glass-walled estate on the outskirts of the city, was filled with those kinds of men. Eddie stepped inside, and the first thing he noticed was how comfortable everyone was. They laughed easily, their voices filling the space, carrying the weight of money, influence, and history. It was the kind of comfort that came from knowing the world had been built in their image. And Eddie knew he would never have that kind of comfort. Not really. Because men like him weren't born into it. They had to earn it. And even then, it was never truly theirs. The game he knew too well. The first drink came fast. The second even faster. Richard introduced him around the room. This is Eddie Daniels, the one who pulled off Westbrook last year. A few raised eyebrows. A couple of approving nods. A handshake that lasted just a second too long. And then, the real test began. Because these men who smiled and clinked their glasses, were not here to celebrate him. They were here to study him. To measure him. To see if he understood the rules of the game well enough to be allowed to keep playing. And Eddie played. He talked when he needed to. Listened when it was expected. He made them laugh just enough. Disagreed just enough. Proved he could belong just enough. But he knew. He always knew. There was a line. One he could never cross without losing everything. The conversation that shifted the room. The moment came when the topic turned to politics. Not in the obvious way. Not in the way that made headlines. But in the way powerful men talked when they thought they were among their own. It's the culture. Really, one of them said, swirling his drink. Everything's about race now. You can't say anything without offending someone. Another nodded. Take that hiring scandal last month. People screaming about diversity like it's a damn requirement. Richard laughed. It is now. You've got to hire the right kind of minority to keep the board happy. He said it easily, as if it were fact. And then he looked at Eddie. A challenge. A test. As if to say, you understand how this works, don't you? And Eddie knew what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to laugh. Or nod. Or shift the conversation just enough to keep things smooth. That was the rule. That was how men like him stayed in rooms like this. But tonight, something in him refused. The whiskey burned in his throat as he set the glass down. I suppose it depends, Eddie said, his voice even, on whether you think hiring someone qualified is a requirement. The room stilled. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way that would make anyone admit it. But in the subtle shifts. The way back is straightened. The way the easy comfort thinned. Just slightly. Richard's gaze sharpened. A flicker of something that wasn't quite anger. But something close. Of course, he said smoothly, we all believe in hiring the best. There it was. The kind of sentence that meant nothing but ended the conversation. A reminder. A correction. And Eddie knew he had lost something tonight. Maybe not his place in the room. But something unseen. Something understood. Something that meant that no matter how well he played the game, he would always be playing from behind. The walk away. Eddie stayed another hour. Long enough to smooth over whatever tension had rippled through the conversation. Long enough to make sure that no one could say he had been difficult. And then, he left. The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped outside. His car waiting at the curb. And for a moment, he stood there, thinking, wondering. Because that was the thing about nights like this. They weren't about what had been said. They were about what hadn't. About the quiet understanding that the rules were never really going to change. Not for men like him. Eddie exhaled. Then he got in the car. And drove away. Not because he had lost. But because he was starting to wonder if winning was ever really an option. The weight of the evening still sat on Eddie's chest long after he had left Richard Alden's estate. He had played the game. Played it well. In fact, knew just when to nod. When to smile. When to let a comment pass by like it hadn't been heard. And yet, one sentence. One carefully worded response. One refusal to laugh at the right time. And something had shifted. A line had been drawn. Not by him. By them. The unspoken cost. The drive back into the city was long. Eddie barely noticed the lights flashing past. The hum of the tires on pavement. His mind was elsewhere. Back in that room. In the flicker of Richard's expression. The way the air had changed. It had been subtle. Not outright rejection. Not exile. No. These things never happened all at once. Instead, they happened in small, imperceptible ways. A lunch invitation that never came. A meeting that moved without him being told. A decision made before he was in the room. A slow drifting. A quiet erasure. That was how power worked. Not with a slammed door. With a door that was never quite open in the first place. The last warning. His phone buzzed just as he pulled onto his street. A message. From someone who had been there tonight. A man he had once thought of as a friend. You should be careful. That was all it said. Eddie stared at the screen. Thumb hovering over the keyboard. Careful. Careful of what? Of telling the truth? Of thinking, even for a second, that he could speak plainly and not pay for it? He could feel it now. The slow, creeping certainty that tonight had not been just another night. Tonight was a reminder that even when they let you in, they were always waiting for a reason to shut you out. The decision. The next morning, Eddie sat at his desk. The city stretching out beyond the window. His assistant had left a neat stack of files. Meetings lined up, calls scheduled, his life, still moving forward. But something was different now. Because now, Eddie knew. He had always known, of course. Had always understood the rules. But there was a difference between knowing and feeling it settle in your bones. Between understanding the cost and deciding whether to keep paying it. The quiet truth. He picked up his phone. Dialed a number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. You're up early, the voice said. I need to talk to you. Eddie said. A pause. Then, are you finally ready? Eddie closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of all the years spent navigating a game that had never been made for him. The moments when he had swallowed his words. The long silences that had stretched in rooms where he had been allowed, but never truly welcomed. And he thought of last night. Of Richard's voice, smooth as ever, but carrying a warning. Of the text message that still sat on his phone. From the moment he had finally realized, that no matter how well he played, the game had already been decided. Yes, Eddie said, his voice steady. I'm ready. And just like that, the game changed.